Great, thank you, Fiona, and welcome. I think everybody's in now, so we'll make a start. A little bit about the agenda. This is what we're going to cover this morning. We're looking at, I suppose, the key issues here in these standards are the commonalities between them, and we're going to specifically look at the governance standard. We're going to talk a little bit about a risk-based approach and it's almost a risk-based approach to complying with standards. And then we'll talk a little bit about compliance, achieving the compliance and monitoring. And probably one of the biggest issues as we go through the thing this morning is the evidence. So we'll basically be about 30 minutes with the slide deck and then 15 minutes at the end for questions. That's the current schedule. So we'll try and achieve that. A little bit about who we are for those of you who don't know us. We're in the risk and compliance business. We are all risk and compliance professionals at some level, and we've been in this business for about 13 or 14 years, and we deal with an awful lot of regulated entities. You can see there from a slide, gives you an idea of the kind of the width to what we do, and we have been working with approved housing bodies for some time, with the HARO guidelines up to now at different levels, tier 1, 2, and 3 of the HARO, and now we're looking at putting the AHBRA standards and guidelines into the system, and look forward to working with some of you while we do that. These are the standards, as you know, published early in this year, and the guidelines were published at the end of the summer. So the 4 standards, there's commonality to them, and we'll talk a little bit about the detail of the commonality to them. I suppose one of the things that we talk about when we're dealing with standards is what the regulator is trying to achieve. So the regulator set out their expectations for how the sector will organize and operate, and that's what this is. There are 4 of them. All regulation legislation has its core, the core mission is to protect society, and it's often informed by experience and the wisdom gained from experience. So you may find that over time these will be amended and adjusted, and good regulators will amend and adjust the standards as they get a sense for what's happening with them. And one of the things to remember with these is this regulation is what it is. It's here. It is the law of the land. It's so, we often find people who get into denial about regulation. This is the regulation that's in place. I draw your attention to this, and I'm just going to go off the video here for a minute so you can see the top right hand one is the scale of justice one, and it's an important thing, I think, because I lifted these values. It's on the front page of the standards, and basically what they're saying here is that the regulator will deliver independent, proportionate, and fair regulatory oversight. And I sense that they are a fair regulator. They will be a fair regulator, and they make that kind of statement. There's a willingness there to work with the sector, to understand the issues and problems of the sector. But that said, they will never walk away from their remit, which is to regulate the sector, and they will regulate the sector even-handedly, and generally they would regulate the sector consistently. Obviously, the proportionate piece deals with the different sizes of AHBs that have come across. So you would expect that, but do bear in mind that key aspects of the standards and the regulator's expectations will apply to every approved housing body. And the same problem earlier on, we're getting that to move along. But the 4 standards, The governance standard is the first one, then the financial standard, property and asset management standard, and the tenancy management standard. They're well structured. They're a very good set that cover key aspects of the sectoral activity, as you can see here. And while there are some aspects that overlap, the fundamental requirements and expectations are laid out in each of them, and together they combine to guide housing and tenant related aspects of the sector. So it's there are other things that aren't in this that apply to the sector, as you know, the laws and regulations such as the General Data Protection legislation, the environmental health and safety generally, all your HR stuff, project management, and one that is significant is IT security standards, and increasingly, while they're not regulatory, they are becoming an expectation that certainly larger organizations would be expected to ensure that there are no data breaches. In any event, this is the set that now regulates the sector. So we've looked at the standards and basically looked at the expected outcomes. So you can see here tabulated for each of the 4 standards are the expected outcomes, and we've also tabulated and made a count of the must demonstrates. For us, the logic behind doing that is to, I suppose, quantify the depth and amount of material that's in here with the requirements of the standard, because what we'll do is break it down, and in breaking it down, we're looking for the must. Now, we said must demonstrate here, and we'll take a look at how that's laid out in the detail. I'm sure you're all familiar with it. We will look at it. It's hard to count the musts because there's different language used within the standards, and I'll talk a little bit about that later on. But these are the big requirements, if you like, that they have specifically written in the standards, and they say they must demonstrate. And there's nothing in the guidelines that suggests that they won't expect that AHBs will be able to demonstrate these things. So there's an evidencing requirement at the end of the whole process. And that's the count. So if you look at this one, this is a direct pick from the governance standard. If you look down the bottom, there's where the must demonstrates are. So the structure of all of the standards is the same, so they're all presented this way. And if you look through it, there's a statement of the expected outcome. There's a description of the context. The context will vary depending on the size. The proportionality comes into that context comment. Depending on the size of the AHB, depending on the mandate. It's important to remember that some of the AHBs, some of you that are on here today will have different mandates. The depth of service provided by some is incredible, actually. It's enormous, depending on who you're dealing with, depending on the tenants, depending on whether you're in a building business, whether you're managing big projects. So you will know the width of it, and that's the context. So each one will have its own context, and the regulation would be proportional to that context. That said, they won't surrender on any of the things that the AHBs must be able to demonstrate if the activity is within your mandate. So just to highlight and illustrate this, the structured standards, they show the first expected outcome of the governance standard, and the summary is set out in bullet points. And to be able to demonstrate in order to satisfy the regulatory requirement, some would say in order to be compliant, but the key issue here is to do the right thing. At the end of the day, that's what particularly the governance piece, that's what the organization is expected to do. And if it's right, the probability is that you will be compliant or very close to compliant if you're doing the right thing. The compliance is an outcome, and it is an outcome that is readily achieved if you follow the guidelines and do the right thing. But the regulator is, like Ronald Reagan said, trusting is good, but checking is better. So the regulator has the authority to do that check and to expect that they're on foot of their requirement, that the AHB will be able to demonstrate. And that runs through each of the 4 standards. And what they're expecting the AHB to demonstrate is both specific and emphatic. So, and they do detail the expected outcomes, and they expect to see policies and processes and procedures that arrive at the outcomes or will cause you to arrive at the outcomes. They specify the requirements to demonstrate, looking for evidence of what is achieved and how it's measured. So basically, I suppose we always think in risk terms, they're looking for establishment. So they're looking to see how you have established the basis on which you are going to comply, or in my own head, the basis on which you're going to do the right thing for your stakeholders to satisfy your mandate. They're looking to see how you monitor to know that your controls remain effective. And they're looking to see the kind of things that you measure, because it's in what you measure that the source of evidence will lie. So are you measuring complaints? Are you measuring incidents? Are you measuring, how are you measuring your audit findings? Are you measuring the control points, the touch points, to ensure that your controls are effective? In and across the standards, there are a number of frameworks mentioned, and the frameworks tend to overlap, and I tried to graphically present them this way. There's a risk framework, there's mention of a risk framework, there's mention of an internal control framework, and there's an internal audit framework. And those are sort of banded together as governance arrangements. And then in addition, there's an external audit requirement, and they're all put together under an assurance framework, which is an interesting way to do it, and I'm going to say relatively unique. It's something that we would have seen maybe in high end of the banking industry. They look for this kind of large overarching framework, and it's interesting to see it here. And it probably gives a little bit of flexibility in terms of the proportionality that we talked about, for having different contexts and different sizes and different mandated firms within the remit of the regulator. So there's a sense of overlapping, there's a sense of folding back, if you like. Sometimes when you read the guidelines, and maybe the standards and the guidelines, you think, oh God, I've come across this before, and is this part of the risk framework the same as the internal control framework? And to some extent, there is a bit of blending there. Just be aware that they're there. Next thing we're talking about is a risk-based approach. So most of the regulation that has happened probably since the banking crisis has been and looked for a risk-based approach to managing compliance, but a risk-based approach is first of all establishing the context, and that gives you obviously in brackets here the proportionality. But once the context is established, you begin then to look at, okay, what do I need to do? And that's where some of the documentation takes place. That's the policies, process, and procedures. Like, you need to have those in place almost before you proceed. So if you think we're starting the business from the beginning, and we know you're not, and I would say to you that in all probability, 90% of what you are expected to do under this regulatory framework of the 4 standards, you probably have in place already. So you don't need to reinvent. You're not starting the business from the beginning. So you will have your establishment stuff in place, like your policies, your processes, and your procedures. There's no need to jettison them. What you do need is to make an evaluation of them. The other thing they look for is the assignment of responsible individuals. So who owns the various policies and processes and procedures? And then how are they communicated and reported? So what are you looking at in terms of reports? And in here, both in the responsible piece and the communication reporting piece, you'll be looking for resource. So where's the resource, the operations resource, the organization? Is the organization resource sufficiently well resourced in terms of headcount, in terms of assets, in terms of finances? It's sufficiently well resourced to deliver its mandate. And then you're looking to see, well, okay, how do we know how we're doing? So how are we doing is about measuring. It's about establishing what you want to measure, and then it's about monitoring. So how do you know your controls are effective? And through that, there's a process at the tail of it, which is a review. So this is like a plan, do, check, act cycle in risk management, probably very similar to what you would be doing in your quality systems. And then at the end of it, what the regulator is looking for is the ability to demonstrate with evidence. So you're not demonstrating, you're not telling him, ticking a box and saying, yeah, we do that. They may and will and have the right to come back and say, well, show me how you do that. And that generally is from the monitoring, monitoring, the measurement and the review is where that ball of evidence resides. Key terms the regulator has, and this is the language of the standards. So when we look at a standard, and Fiona is our expert on this, you look at the key things here. You're looking at the word must appears, and sometimes the word must is hidden in terms like it is the responsibility of, or the regulator expects, or it is essential that, or it is critical that. Now you can take those any way you want, but we see them as must. So we did a must count, which is what the regulator has set down as a must, but we also found where the responsibilities, the expects, the essentials, and the criticals and the crucials are within the text. There's also then things that the regulator is suggesting you should do. So when you see should, you make the assumption that, oh yeah, that's a good idea. The regulator thinks that's a good idea. But would the regulator take any action if they came and found that you weren't doing that? Probably not, other than a caution or advice. Next one you'd look at is consider. It's again softer. You see the words in there in standards. Awareness is also there, and understand. Generally with the awareness and the understand ones, they tend to be in the governance place, and a lot of the time they're directed at kind of boards. They're expecting that the boards would have a certain amount of knowledge. They're offering guidance to the, they're informing the strategic plan. They're offering guidance to the senior management team in order to better define the mandate and to ensure that the mandate is basically achieved properly, and the governance is there. So they tend to be, there are some hard musts around boards, but also they tend to use the awareness and understand phrases. So there's an expectation that all of those things will be addressed. Again, I'd say context, proportionality, the size. Some may not have boards, so you know there's a space here to consider the mandate, the scale of the mandate, the scale of the organization, and operate proportionally while at the same time trying to satisfy the text of the various standards. Compliance is an outcome of good risk management. And basically, if the risk is the failure to comply with a particular legal or regulatory requirement, then that's compliance failure. And the risk is the failure to do that, and that's the risk you'll be trying to mitigate. We've tabulated the requirements and the acceptable means of compliance suggested in the text, presented the governance standard in 6 governance risks that when assessed in the round, where affirmative answers can be supported by relevant evidencing, they'll satisfy the requirements of the standards. Particularly, I'm talking about the governance one in particular. Some of the others, exactly the same thing happens with the others, and we go through the process of doing that breakdown. And risk is basically expressed as the failure to comply with the legal requirement, the regulatory requirement, or the fiduciary obligations, whatever it is, where the requirements are laid down. And again, I'd say to you not to be frightened by this, because the establishment part of the process here is once you've established the requirements, and we set them up in risk terms. Once that work is done, generally what you've got is this great big gap analysis, and no matter how you do it, you're going to sit down and do a gap analysis and say, okay, what are the requirements? Have I met them? And do that cross-check. But my sense is that from either a lot of you will already have been part of the voluntary code, the AHBRA standards, be it tier 1, 2, or 3, and you will know, that you do have a lot of this stuff in place already. It's reusable. A process to manage a particular thing is still the same process to manage a particular thing, no matter what the regulation. The regulation has a new name, the regulator has a new name, but the fundamental requirement of the things that it needed to satisfy the business objectives are still the same. Okay, so these are the various titles that we've used in breaking down the governance standard. I'll show you these, and then the next slide I'll show you the one of them that's actually been advanced. So we talked earlier on about the control framework. You see the bottom one, that is in the governance structure. So it's in the governance code, governance standard. So failure to have an effective and proportionate control framework. So basically what that is saying is that the control framework is, if you like, I'm going to call it a monitoring part. So you have the controls, you're reaching up beyond those controls, just to confirm that the things that are in the controls that the regulator suggests should be there are there and operationally effective. So in combination with the risk, you have the associated monitoring, and the risk text, the requirements will inform the monitoring requirement, if you like. This is one of the risks in the system. So you're looking at a failure to comply with all relevant legal, regulatory, funding, and statutory obligations. I suppose one of the things to do here is to know what they are, and it's probably where people begin to sort of think, "Oh God, have I got them all?" And generally, yes, you will have them all. The things that you have been managing for the last number of years, since you have been established. You have internal and external audit. You'll have your quality processes. You'll have your risk management function, your compliance function. So in the round somewhere, you have most of this stuff. What you may not have is a methodology of sort of filtering through it and making what you have accessible and making the data useful, particularly to give you the gap analysis. So really what you're doing is looking to confirm the 90% that you do have, and looking to find out what the 10% that you don't, what that is, and get about putting it in place. So they detail, again, some of the expected outcomes, and they expect to see the policies and processes, procedures that are in place to arrive at those outcomes. And again, watch the specification to demonstrate the evidence, particularly for the MUS. So what I've got here is just an indication of the current compliance estimation. This we always find with people who do this, it tends to be motivational. They start out with a sort of a big yellow list, but there's not much happening, and then suddenly they answer, "Oh, I have that, I have that, I have that," and as they go through the process, they begin to identify the things they have. There's great joy in watching the growth of the things that they have. And it's basically once that establishment is finished, that what tends to happen here is you're confirming the establishment, finding your 90%, go off and identify the kind of 10% of things. Now, it may well be that somebody has all this stuff in place already, and if you may well have it all. But my sense is there's always a couple of aha moments in this process. That you say, oh God, I don't have that. And you will get a bit of that. There's a tendency also to begin the revision process, to begin looking at the things. Because it's a new regulator doesn't mean that the old process that you had, there's something wrong with it. There isn't necessarily. So take your time to do your revisions once you've confirmed what you have, will be my advice, and do your revision cycle in 3, whatever it is, 1, 2 or 3 years, that you review these policies and procedures. The only thing you would do is where you're getting feedback. So if you're getting feedback from your metrics and you're measuring to say that my level of incidence is too high, or I get my complaints closed fast enough, or that kind of intelligence that you're gathering from your system and your registers, make sure that you apply that intelligence to the monitoring that you're doing, to say, yeah, I need to change this process because I'm not getting the expected results here. But do bear in mind also that these things can be influenced by resource. I'm back again to resource generally is money, it's skills, and it's people. So yeah, these things take resource to get done. This is the monitoring, just an indication of what the monitoring looks like when you're gathering data. If you're going to ask a question, wherever it might be, and you will, because some of you are running incredibly complicated organizations with incredible reach, that carry incredible detail, and you reach out and check and test the controls at many levels, and you're doing that today, and that is the evidence, that is the response, that is what the regulator would expect you to be able to demonstrate. Given the mandate of the regulator, and it is a huge mandate, the probability is that they will look for certain information. They will probably put together an audit cycle, so they will come with some regularity. Our experience, for example, in the credit union sector is that they do what they call the Central Bank of Ireland do thematic reviews. They also do they'll do audits. They'll do specific audits. And there's some pattern to they do it, so that's their kind of daily job or business as usual. And then generally they respond, and it's true, I think, of most regulators. The Data Protection Commissioner is the same. They respond to complaints, they respond to issues raised, they might respond to media articles, they might respond to social media, something going on there. And they're alerted to do something, and they have the right to come and do an audit and ask for whatever you want. And it's this monitoring, having these data, obviously makes the process of explaining and the process of demonstrating your effective effort. Doesn't mean you'll be perfect. There will be errors. Stuff happens. Resources get stressed and strained. But as I say, a fair regulator, that's a fair understanding of the kind of things that can happen on a daily basis. But have your monitoring, and obviously it helps to better run the business as well. These are the top again. I put up the others, the property, the tenancy, and the financial one. Very similar in structure, very similar in shape. Same thing. The musts. There's an obligation to demonstrate. As I say, many of them already exist in your current risk and compliance policies and procedures and your registers. Many organizations don't realize how much they have. And I'm saying, I suppose the strong message here I'm saying is that don't panic. You haven't been in the business you're in and succeeded in the business you're in for as long as you've been in it, without being pretty well regulated and more or less in line with the regulatory environment. What do you evidence? You will have a strategic plan. So performance against the strategic plan is obviously the first place to go. A lot of your annual reports, for example, will include your financial performance. Those kind of reports, there'll be some words in there as well. So absolutely, that's part of your evidencing. Your complaints register, if you're dealing with a lot of tenancy, a lot of tenant issues, if you have a lot of face-to-face with the public. Your incidents register, and that includes your EH&S stuff. It includes your tenant stuff, whatever you seek to, you would put in the incidents register. The idea here is that record it. It's a no-blame environment. Record the stuff that is reported. Have systems there to report. Get it into your incidents register. Get it into your complaints register. Get it into your audit finding. Then you can fix it. But if it's covered over, if it's hidden, then you have to hope you can chase it forever. The audit findings, there's corrective and preventive actions arising from your audit findings. Make sure they get A, open, and B, closed out. And you can talk about things like project outcomes. Many of you will be involved in some very, very serious projects, both in the repair and maintenance side and in the new build side. So there's an awful lot of stuff out there that you would have in the normal course of events, and just put the hat on that says we can use these reports and these data as evidence to support our compliance regime. Just put up a slide that gives you an idea of the integrated mix of the kind of things you can be doing. And I would say to you, thank you very much for your time and attention. And I'm going to come back on the screen first because I have been invisible. Just and maybe I'd ask Fiona to join me again, and we can take questions and answers. I hope you've got some benefit from it, and thank you very much for your time this morning.
Okay, so the first question is, what's the main difference between the AHBRA standard and the Charities Regulatory Standard? Does one supersede the other, as the AHBRA one appears to be far more comprehensive?
They are two different things. The Charities Regulator is regulating a very large series of diverse entities and an awful lot of them. And basically, it's a very broad remit. It's a governance standard, so it's only one standard. Bear in mind that the AHBRA standards, there are 4 of them, and they are more specific. So that's why the broader remit is there. Not every charity would have dealing with tenancies, properties. They all have finances for certain, but not to the extent, I think, of the finances that you're looking at, the complexity of the finances you're looking at in the approved housing bodies. The requirements are the same. So far, we haven't seen sight of the detailed sight of the reporting requirements of the AHBRA standards. And we don't know what the regulator, we don't know yet what the regulator will look for. There will be a reporting process, whether they want to do it every year or whether it's something that they want to know exists. Whereas on the charity side, there is a very specific report outlined, the report that they want. They don't want to have them, but they want to know they exist, and they want to be able to call on the charities that they regulate anytime to get those reports. So they're aligned, they're parallel, particularly at things like board level, and there is certainly a degree of duplication between the two of them, but they are separate. And the AHBRA is more detailed, it is larger, and it is seeking to govern more of the specific sector on a wider platform.
Thanks. What's the current situation with the length of board tenure issue?
Board tenure, yeah, it's board tenure is one of these how long is a piece of string questions. It's a tough one because first of all, most regulators have been wary about being specific about board tenure. So we come across an awful lot of standards, and one that comes to my head is code of practice for the governance of state bodies, for example. They're very specific about the tenure of directors, but there are circumstances, for example, if somebody was a board member for a number of years and then was to become the chairman, the term might be extended. One of the key things to have is a succession plan. And the other thing is, and I came across an organization recently where basically the whole board would retire in rotation at the same time, which means that there's a whole lot of corporate memory loss. So your succession plan should be looking at that a percentage, a proportion of the board would retire in rotation. And how many times you get re-elected, I don't know. My own thought was always 6 years. And when you go to the schools of governance and people that teach governance, they sort of say, yeah, once you've been in a place for more than 6 years, where all the bodies are buried, and you probably know too much about the organization and your own interest to move on. However, for certain roles, key roles on the board and for the chairman, you probably could extend that, but again, nobody will make a recommendation on it. It's alluded to, and I know that particularly in the charity space, an awful lot of people would have been wary about putting anything hard down. I think it'll harden over time, but yeah, when you've got somebody who might have been a founder and somebody who is hugely beneficial to the organization, there is an opportunity. I'm always, when asked this question, think about emeritus professors, somebody who can be still around the place, still valued for an opinion, but slightly distant from the operational end of the business or the board end of the business. So some roles like that have been around for those who are particularly meritorious and have been very useful to the organization. So don't know, no answer really, no straight answer.
Okay, so the next question. Is there an appeal mechanism for regulatory decision?
Generally, yes. There'll be something in there somewhere. It won't be advertised because they won't be looking for it. But do bear in mind, the second big bullet on the first page that I showed you today is a scale of justice. And one of the things this regulator said they were going to be is a fair regulator. And I believe that they are, and I believe they will be, and I believe that that's their ambition. So in there somewhere, there would be some kind of an appellate process that would allow somebody who was looking to do something that maybe they were trying to explain why they haven't done something, and if they were sanctioned, that there would be some kind of an appeal. But at the same time, I think everybody has to bear in mind that you can make an appeal to the local guard, but at the same time, if you're breaking the speed limit, you're breaking the speed limit, therefore you're breaking the law. So, what you're appealing against would be important there, but there will be a mechanism that they will at least listen. They give you a first listen. So don't know what the mechanism would look like. I don't know how benign they would be. And like any law, once you begin to make an exception for one, then everybody else perceives it to be a right. So yeah, I would imagine. Do talk to them, but you have to accept their answer.
And the final question here, for smaller AHBs, are there recommended templates for risk registers?
There are all sorts of templates out there for risk registers. We use risk register, we generate risk registers, and we use the basic process we use is the process of the ISO 31000 International Risk Management Standard. There are different methodologies and different ways of doing it, but there are lots of templates out there. But if you wanted to send me a mail or Fiona a mail, we certainly give you some of whatever wisdom we have on it. It's not that difficult, and we're more than happy to help with whatever we've got. There's probably some stuff on our website as well if you want to take a look. I'm happy to guide you through that anytime.
Great, thanks, Paul. And that's it for questions. But obviously, if people have questions, that occur to them later today or anytime in the future, you're more than welcome to drop us a line. And thanks, Paul.
Okay. Thank you very much again for your time and interest. And as I say, we are always here, and when we do see the reporting requirement, we'll probably come back and talk a little bit about that again. So again, thank you very much for your attention. I hope you've got something from it, and good luck with the compliance journey. Thanks.